So how would you teach a child the difference between right and wrong if you couldn't rely on any traditional authority? Like
Wow.
no religion, no mainstream culture. Just imagine trying to raise a good person in the modern world from absolute scratch.
It sounds exhausting, honestly.
Right. You're completely alone, just trying to figure out which rules actually matter, which behaviors to enforce, and how to make any of it actually stick.
Yeah.
And you'd probably find out pretty quickly what a man named James Ilos found out. So Elos is a strict practicing atheist, but he's currently raising his family by actively following the behavioral codes of ancient Christianity.
Which is such a wild pivot.
It really is. And it's not because he suddenly found God, right? It's
Yeah.
because he realized he was trying to write a brand new operating system for his family from scratch
Yeah.
while completely ignoring the most debugged, Darwinian tested survival software in human history.
Right, which forces us to look at human traditions through like an entirely different lens. You're essentially trying to build this complex load-bearing architectural structure,
Yeah.
but you've just thrown away the structural engineering blueprints
Mm.
that previous generations relied on to keep the roof from caving in.
Exactly. Okay, so let's unpack this because that really frustrating, deeply personal dilemma is the premise of today's deep dive. We are looking at this fascinating April 2026 white paper from the Prothean Institute titled Thus Spake Elos.
Yeah, it's a brilliant title.
Our mission for this deep dive is to explore the paper's core, highly provocative thesis, which is that religious traditions don't survive across thousands of years because of their metaphysical truth,
Right.
but because they are the ultimate behavioral codes for human flourishing. They're survival strategies that basically won out in a brutal evolutionary competition.
Right. And to do this properly, we have to establish the author's analytical framework right at the top. Because for the duration of this conversation, we are entirely putting aside the question of whether God exists.
Right. They're not touching the theology.
Exactly. The paper brackets that as epistemically undecidable. So instead, it looks purely at the fitness and functional outcomes of religious practice.
Okay.
We're analyzing these ancient traditions as replicating systems that face, Darwinian selection pressures. It's the exact same mechanism as biological evolution,
Yeah.
just applied to human culture.
Okay, so the paper actually starts with Elos's personal catalyst, which grounds this massive theory in a very relatable way, I think.
Yeah, the kitchen table realization.
Yes. So when his kids were young, he wanted to give them moral fortitude, right? He wanted them to value discipline over impulse, to choose obligation to their community over personal convenience.
Which every parent wants.
Right. But as a secular parent, he refused to outsource that moral education to social media algorithms or, the standard modern education system.
Yeah, understandably.
So he literally finds himself sitting at the kitchen table, painfully trying to reinvent a comprehensive moral code from first principles.
And what's fascinating here is what he discovered during that process. Because every rule he painstakingly invented, rules that were designed to prioritize long-term flourishing over short-term gratification, they already existed in ancient texts.
Yeah.
He was basically reverse engineering a wheel that had already been invented, tested, and refined through, the accumulated experience of thousands of societies over thousands of years.
But the rules themselves weren't even the hardest part for him, right?
Right, the enforcement.
Yeah. He realized that religions didn't just invent moral codes, they invented these brilliant embedded propagation mechanisms.
Infrastructure.
Exactly, an infrastructure to make the rules stick. Weekly gatherings for communal reinforcement, statements of commitment spoken out loud before every meal, life cycle rituals for, birth, coming of age, marriage.
And as an isolated secular parent, he just couldn't replicate that kind of ubiquitous, constant social infrastructure entirely on his own.
Right.
And this brings us to a crucial biological concept that the paper leans on heavily, which is cultural inheritance.
Okay, break that down for us.
So we're culturally conditioned to think of evolution purely in terms of genetics, right? Like physical traits passed down through DNA.
Sure.
But cultural inheritance is actually a massive driver of biological fitness, and we see it all across the animal kingdom. The paper provides a few incredible examples, like take Australian crows.
Oh, the cane toad thing.
Yeah. So highly poisonous cane toads were introduced to Australia in 1935, and they were totally deadly to predators. But local crows have developed this highly specific multi-step process to safely eat them.
Wow.
They lift the toads, drop them from a height to stun them, flip them over, and carefully eat them from the belly to completely avoid the poison glands on the back.
And there's just no way a crow is figuring out a four-step culinary process for a toxic toad through blind genetic mutation in just a few decades.
Exactly. Or rather, the timeline proves the mechanism. Genetics just moves too slowly for that kind of adaptation. That behavior is being actively taught and transmitted culturally from crow to crow, generation across generation.
Right.
The paper also mentions orcapods that have culturally transmitted the technique of hunting great white sharks.
Which is terrifying, by the way.
Oh, totally terrifying. The orcas figure out that if they physically ram the shark and flip it completely upside down, it triggers a reflex called tonic immobility.
Right. It paralyzes them.
Exactly. The shark becomes completely helpless, making it safe for the orcas to consume. And older orcas actually actively demonstrate this flipping technique to the younger members of the pod.
That is so crazy.
Yeah. So these are highly fitness-relevant behaviors transmitted entirely through cultural lineages. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the author references this recent 2025 research by Waring and Wood.
Okay.
It demonstrates that cultural inheritance is actually overtaking genetic inheritance as the primary driver of human adaptation. So according to this framework, religious traditions are just the oldest, most extensively stress-tested cultural inheritance systems in human history.
You know, reading this, my mind immediately went to open source software.
Oh, that's a good comparison.
Right. Because you've got this massive, complex operating system, let's call it Civilization OS, that has been debugged over thousands of years by billions of users.
Yeah.
Every social glitch has been patched. Every vulnerability to human selfishness has been tested in real-world environments. So Ilos is sitting there in his house trying to write a brand new operating system from scratch by himself and suddenly realizes the most stable, bug-free version is already freely available online.
Right.
Why wouldn't you just run the established software?
That analogy captures his realization perfectly.
Yeah.
But the paper takes it a step further and raises an important question. If these behavioral codes are essentially evolutionary survival software, why did almost all the successful ones evolve to include an all-seeing, omniscient deity?
Yeah, that's the big question.
Right? Why couldn't they just stay as practical, secular rulebooks?
Yeah.
Well, to understand the necessity of a God concept, we have to look at the structural problem of human scaling.
Okay.
The paper outlines this in what it calls the moral enforcement scale theory, or MEST.
Right, so MEST breaks human social development into distinct stages. Starting with stage 1, the tribe, which is any community below the Dunbar number, which anthropologists place at roughly 150 people.
Exactly.
And the paper points out that at this tribal scale, humans literally don't need a concept of God to enforce morality.
Right. The biological constraint makes it unnecessary. At the tribal scale, every single action is observed by someone you know.
Because everyone knows everyone.
Exactly. The human neocortex can maintain stable social relationships with about 150 individuals. So within that limit, honor and shame work flawlessly. If you steal food from your neighbor, everyone in your social network knows about it before the sun goes down, and the social cost to your survival is devastating.
Right, you might get exiled.
Yeah, so the observation network is perfectly airtight.
But then humanity hits stage 2, the village and the city. Populations grow, we scale past that 150-person neocortex limit, and suddenly you're living around strangers. Anonymity becomes possible.
And anonymity introduces a massive structural vulnerability that the paper calls the Judas problem.
Oh, this is fascinating.
So in a high-trust tribal society where everyone generally cooperates, selective defection becomes highly profitable. Let's say you realize you can cheat a business partner when nobody's looking. In a city, you can take that stolen wealth, relocate 3 streets over into a completely new social circle, and never face the reputational consequences.
Wow.
For a self-interested actor, cheating becomes the most rational behavior in an environment where the observation network has holes in it.
So if I'm living in an early city and I can cheat my neighbor and just move away, the whole honor system just collapses.
Exactly.
The only way to stop me from defecting is if someone is following me everywhere, which is impossible unless it's someone who's invisible.
You've hit on the exact mechanism the paper calls the axial age innovation. Roughly between the 6th and 4th centuries BCE, massive civilizations across the globe independently created concepts of universal divine surveillance. The author argues they didn't just invent religion, they invented a portable enforcement mechanism.
So portable enforcement.
Yeah. God acts as the functional substitute for tribal observation. You can't outrun God's reputation network by moving to the next town over because the observer's internalized.
Okay, wait, I have to challenge this on behalf of anyone listening right now.
Sure.
Isn't that exactly what secular laws, courts, and police forces are for? Like, why do we need divine surveillance today when we have a secular justice system to catch the defectors and enforce the rules?
And the author anticipates that exact pushback when detailing Stage 3, the secular metropolis.
Okay.
The paper argues that secular law only provides minimum compliance. The police exist to prevent the absolute worst behaviors, what political philosophers call the Hobbesian war of all against all, right?
Right, where everyone is violently fighting for their own survival.
Exactly. But the law cannot enforce trust. You can't legislate honor or hospitality or that rich behavioral substrate of virtue that makes a community actually pleasant to live in.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The law produces mere compliance. It keeps you out of prison. But compliance without virtue is exactly what a low-trust, atomized society looks like.
So universal religions basically emerge to scale trust beyond the tribe, enforcing virtue when the police aren't looking.
Exactly.
But once these massive operating systems existed, they had to compete against each other. The paper argues they entered a Darwinian survival of the fittest.
Right. And to measure how that competition played out, the paper introduces a three-variable optimization matrix.
Okay, the matrix.
Yeah. The author claims the success of a civilization's operating system depends on how well it balances expansion capacity, civilizational longevity, and innovation freedom.
Right. And the paper gives 4 historical case studies to illustrate this matrix in action. It starts with Mongol paganism under Genghis Khan. They had maximum expansion capacity, like the most rapid military conquest in human history, but they had 0 longevity and 0 independent replication mechanisms.
Because their behavioral code was carried entirely by military force rather than text or independent institutions. So the moment the political structure collapsed, the tradition vanished almost immediately. It lacked the internal architecture to survive a change in environment.
Which makes me think, what happens if a tradition takes the exact opposite approach? What if a code actively avoids expansion and focuses entirely on internal resilience? That perfectly describes the paper's second case study, which is Judaism.
Yeah, the matrix analysis of Judaism is fascinating.
Yeah.
Because it is explicitly non-proselytizing, its expansion capacity is purposefully low. But it has extraordinarily high longevity, surviving millennia of dispersion, exile, and persecution.
Yeah.
And crucially, it maintains high innovation freedom through the Talmudic tradition.
Oh, right.
The Talmud functions almost like an ancient, multi-generational internet forum where scholars rigorously debate and reinterpret laws for new situations. This mechanism allowed the culture to adapt to new environments endlessly, producing massive persistence without seeking civilizational dominance.
So we have the Mongols maximizing expansion and Judaism maximizing longevity and innovation. How does a system try to balance all three? The paper points to Islam specifically during its golden age.
Right. Early Islam solved all three variables incredibly well. It had rapid expansion, robust longevity through Quranic text, and high innovation freedom via institutions like the House of Wisdom in Baghdad.
Which synthesized global scientific and philosophical knowledge.
Exactly. But the paper argues a structural mutation occurred. The author points to the closing of the gates of Ijtihad.
And Ijtihad is?
It's the process of independent legal and theological reasoning. When the institutions promoting that debate were shut down, which was compounded by the devastating Mongol destruction of Baghdad in 1258, the culture lost its mutation mechanism. Yeah, so the Darwinian selection pressure suddenly favored highly traditionalist, rigid variants of the religion. It became incredibly stable against political collapse, but it sacrificed its innovation freedom.
Which brings us to the fourth case study, where the paper claims to find the most optimized balance, post-Reformation Christianity.
According to this specific matrix, post-Reformation Christianity successfully balanced all three variables to become the dominant modern solution. It maximized expansion via the Great Commission to spread the word, coupled with high fertility norms.
Right.
It achieved longevity through texts and the eventual structural separation of church and state.
Yeah.
But the critical piece was the Reformation itself. The advent of the printing press meant individuals could read the Bible in their own language.
Yeah, that changed everything.
It structurally reintroduced innovation freedom by establishing the concept of the individual conscience. Communities could interpret and adapt the code locally without waiting for a centralized authority.
Okay, I want to pause and clarify something crucial here, because I can hear some listeners tensing up at this comparison.
Yeah, fair enough.
Are we just reading a paper that ranks world religions? Like, is the author claiming one theology is spiritually superior to another?
No, the paper is adamant that it is not doing that. This is what the author terms a Madisonian diagnosis.
Okay.
It is completely indifferent to theological or metaphysical claims. It is simply an observation of which behavioral traits and institutional designs happen to survive specific historical and environmental selection pressures. It's an evolutionary analysis, not a spiritual ranking.
Okay, that makes sense. But it introduces a massive contradiction when we look at the modern world. If post-Reformation Christianity provided this highly functional, optimized, structural solution, why are Western societies currently experiencing such a profound crisis?
Yeah.
Because we're seeing severe social atomization, plummeting birth rates, and just an epidemic of lost trust.
And the author argues this is happening because the enforcement mechanism has lost its credibility.
Hmm.
This brings us back to that Madisonian function.
Right, from James Madison.
Exactly, the architect of the U.S. Constitution. He famously observed that men are not angels. Good institutional design acknowledges our selfish nature and aligns our individual self-interest with the collective good. Religious behavioral codes do exactly this.
Mm.
But it is the divine mandate, the belief that God commanded it, that makes those rules non-negotiable.
Because if the ultimate authority in the universe says, thou shalt not, you can't really negotiate a loophole just because following the rule is inconvenient that day.
Right.
But when belief in that divine mandate fades, suddenly all those difficult behavioral rules become completely optional.
And we can see the structural consequences of this in real time. The paper points out that modern progressive churches often attempt to accommodate secular norms to stay culturally relevant.
Right.
They make the behavioral codes easier. But the empirical demographic data shows these accommodating variants are rapidly shrinking. Meanwhile, high traditions that refuse to compromise their codes, such as Orthodox Jewish communities, traditionalist Catholics, and conservative Muslim groups, they are experiencing significant demographic growth.
Wow, so strictness wins.
From a purely Darwinian perspective, making the rules easier is a fitness-reducing mutation. It strips away the exact behavioral demands, like mandatory gathering and strict family structures, that gave the tradition its evolutionary advantage in the first place.
You know, the paper uses this dynamic to launch a major critique of the new atheists.
Oh, yeah. Dawkins, Dennett.
Right, think Richard Dawkins or Daniel Dennett from the early 2000s. The author, who again is an atheist himself, claims they made a fatal structural error. They correctly pointed out the lack of scientific evidence for metaphysical claims, but they completely conflated the delivery mechanism God with the highly functional behavioral codes themselves.
Yeah,
The author's argument makes them sound like trust fund kids.
that's a great way to put it.
Right. They inherited this massive fortune of social capital, built by centuries of demanding religious behavioral coding, and they spent their careers convincing everyone else that earning money is a scam. They failed to realize they were just spending down their inherited principle.
Yeah, the paper asserts they assumed that high-trust, stable, liberal democratic societies were just the natural default state of humanity.
Mm.
They didn't recognize that these societies were the specific, engineered output of a very particular cultural inheritance system.
But what about the obvious counterexamples? Like, people always point to countries like Japan or the Nordic states.
Sure.
These are highly secular, highly functional, high-trust societies that seem to be doing just fine without a divine mandate.
Well, Elos addresses those specific examples, and his diagnosis is stark. He argues these societies are not representing a sustainable new paradigm. Instead, they are running on the depleting fumes of inherited cultural capital.
Ah.
He claims the Nordic states are coasting on residual Protestant homogeneity, and Japan is operating on secularized Confucian shame mechanisms.
So they're spending the principle, too.
Exactly. And the evidence of depletion is visible in their vital statistics. Both regions are facing plummeting fertility rates. Japan's total fertility rate is down to a crisis level of 1.2, and they are seeing rapidly rising rates of social isolation. The paper argues they are living on inherited cultural capital that they are no longer actively generating.
Okay, so what does this all mean for you, the listener? If our collective cultural bank account is draining and you can't just force yourself to genuinely believe in supernatural claims you find implausible, what is the rational path forward?
The paper's ultimate prescriptive conclusion is radical but logically rigorous based on its framework. The author argues that you have a rational, self-interested case to practice the behavioral codes of your civilization's successful tradition, regardless of whether you believe the metaphysics.
Wait, he is literally advocating for practice without belief.
He is. And he backs this up with longitudinal research from Harvard, which demonstrates that it is the practice of religion, specifically the physical act of weekly attendance and participation, not the private belief itself, that predicts greater life satisfaction, lower rates of depression, and reduced substance abuse.
Let's look at the mechanics of that, because the paper explains why the practice actually works. It comes down to habit formation, identity fusion, and something called costly signaling.
Yeah, costly signaling is key.
Right. Think about it. If you give up 10% of your income and your entire Sunday morning to serve in a community, you are proving to the group that you are deeply invested. You can't fake that loss of time and money.
Exactly.
That cost makes you highly trustworthy to the rest of the tribe. And identity fusion is when going through these shared rituals makes you feel fundamentally connected to the larger group, which reduces the anxiety of being alone in the world.
And to conceptualize this shift, the author invokes Friedrich Nietzsche's concept of the three metamorphoses of the spirit.
Oh, this was deep.
Yeah. First is the camel, who blindly carries the heavy burden of tradition without questioning it. Then comes the lion, who destroys the tradition and rejects the burden. This aligns with the new atheist phase of tearing down the old structures.
Right.
Finally, there's the child, who represents genuine openness and the creation of new values. Elos argues that the child, representing humanity's next intellectual evolution, will look at the harsh realities of the human condition and rationally choose to recreate the exact same religious behavioral codes.
Wow.
Why? Because human structural problems, our selfishness, our need for trust, our need for community, haven't changed. The old codes are simply the best tools for the job.
But the author isn't saying we have to pretend it's the 15th century, right? He stresses the Ishihad principle we talked about earlier. We have to keep the door to adaptation open.
Right.
Like, we might choose to strictly observe the Sabbath because structured rest, disconnecting from screens, and gathering with our neighbors is biologically vital for our mental health, even if we don't believe an angry deity will punish us for answering an email on a Sunday.
Exactly.
We adapt the function of the code to the modern environment, but we don't dissolve the code just because the old theology feels unfashionable.
You preserve the structural function while updating the form.
I still struggle with one piece of this, though. Isn't going to a service or observing a ritual without believing performing? Like, won't people see right through the hypocrisy of a non-believer participating in a sacred tradition?
Yeah, but the paper argues that hypocrisy is entirely the wrong framework here. Sincerity in this contest isn't measured by your internal subscription to a list of metaphysical claims. It is measured by your physical commitment to the practice and your contribution to the community's outcomes.
Ah, okay.
If you show up, if you help build the local trust infrastructure,
Yeah.
if you support the families around you when they are struggling, your participation is entirely sincere on a functional evolutionary level. You are actively maintaining the structural integrity of the community.
Wow. We have covered a massive amount of ground today. We started with a frustrated parent trying to teach their kids right from wrong, and we ended up totally redefining religion.
Yeah, completely.
That is a set of supernatural claims for us to endlessly debate, but as a brilliant, time-tested evolutionary technology designed to help humans trust each other, build resilient families, and survive across millennia.
It shifts the entire civilizational conversation from asking, is it objectively true, to asking, does it structurally work?
And the takeaway for you, listening right now, is that you don't have to wait for society to figure this out. You can adopt this rational life design today. You can actively choose long-term flourishing over short-term gratification.
Absolutely.
You could literally start this weekend by treating your days off with the strict reverence of an ancient Sabbath, structuring your rest, gathering with your community, deliberately disconnecting from the economic grind completely, regardless of your personal theology.
It is a deliberate, conscious choice to participate in the ancient mechanisms of human flourishing.
But as we wrap up, there is one final lingering thought from the paper that I just cannot stop thinking about. When discussing stage 4 of the moral enforcement scale theory, the paper notes what is beginning to happen as we fail to manually practice these ancient codes.
Yeah, this is the scary part.
We are currently seeing entirely secular systems like eBay's seller ratings, Airbnb's review systems, and the implementation of China's social credit system, all attempting to rebuild tribal reputation systems at a massive scale.
Right, the paper refers to this looming phase as The binary collapse.
Because if universal divine surveillance has lost its cultural credibility and we don't step up to manually practice these trust-building codes ourselves,
Yeah.
are we inadvertently building a new, inescapable, algorithmic digital surveillance system to take the place of an all-seeing God?
Yeah.
Will the divine mandate simply be replaced by the digital mandate, where we only behave because our data is being tracked?
It's a chilling question about what ultimately fills the structural vacuum when the old behavioral blueprints are thrown away.
It really makes you think differently about how you're going to teach a child the difference between right and wrong. Are you preparing them for a world of internal moral fortitude based on ancient wisdom, or a world where they only cooperate because the algorithm is watching, something for you to mull over? Until next time, thanks for taking the deep dive with us.